Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter with Corporate Board Member, and we have a very interesting show today. The title of it is A Veteran Board Member at Age 45, which doesn't sound like it can be right, but my guest today is going to explain that to us, and we have plenty of questions for her. So let me introduce her. Joining me is Sara Grootwassink Lewis, who's the CEO of Lewis Corporate Advisors and a board member of CapitalSource, Inc. and PS Business Parks. And welcome, Sara.
Thank you for having me here.
So the first thing that may be good, we'll get into the sort of the history about that title in a minute, but
Sure.
First thing we want to do is take a moment and just tell the audience what is CapitalSource and what is PS Business Parks.
Sure. CapitalSource is the board I joined in 2004, and it is a commercial finance company that owns a bank that serves the middle market with commercial real estate and other types of lending. It's about a $9 billion asset organization at this point. PS Business Parks is an owner of office and industrial companies throughout the United States, and so they own office, flex, and industrial distribution facilities throughout the West Coast, East Coast, and the middle south of the country.
Okay, so let's get to the meat of this discussion. So you first joined the board, a board at age 36.
Yes.
So obviously I don't have to tell you that that's not the norm,
Right.
okay, of what's happening. But at the same time, you weren't a rookie. You had
No.
been a CFO of a public company,
Correct.
okay,
Right.
obviously at a very young age on
Right.
that as well. But share with us, if you would, sort of the experience of being invited and you know what sort of led up to that invitation.
Sure. Well, I was fortunate enough to spend a lot of time in the boardroom at the company where I served as the chief financial officer. And it was my external auditor really that had recommended me to CapitalSource when they were going through their IPO process and they needed audit committee members. So he had seen me in action and recommended me. And so I was very fortunate in that I spent a lot of time in the boardroom with some very good board members, in essence answering to a board. But in that time, I learned what I think are the four most important roles of an independent board member. And that is, the first is certainly having the right CEO in the chair and having a good CEO succession plan for when that CEO needs to be replaced. I think the second is making sure that management has a sound strategy, that they're implementing that strategy well, and that their performance is measured against that and they're compensated based on that. Third is just your general, corporate governance duties that you have, be it the audit committee, corporate governance committee, or compensation. And then fourth is really to make sure that both you as a board member and your board as a team, as well as a management team, is really fulfilling your duty as a fiduciary to the shareholders.
Did you find when you joined the board that it was comfortable for you? I mean, were you initially well received? Did a lot of people have questions?
No, because CapitalSource was a relatively new, it was a very new company. It had just gone through the IPO process. It was a very young management team, very young and dynamic and successful management team. The founder had already had a public company that was successful and he had sold, so this was his second one. And yet he was maybe 40 when that occurred. And so it was a very young team. And so we had some people on the board that were relatively young, and then we had some older, experienced venture capital and private equity people as well. But it was a very good experience.
Well, we are seeing younger people take board seats. What's interesting is just recently we've had a 29-year-old woman, a 32-year-old woman, and yourself, all of which were, again, most recent ones. So it's interesting that the youngest were women.
Right.
But when somebody joins a board in their 30s, that means that even if you took the average mandatory retirement age that's
Right.
out there, that means that you could serve on the board for another 36 years.
Right.
Okay, under anybody's guidelines, that would be
Right.
too long to serve.
I
But
agree.
it raises the question about if this is going to be a trend and what happens. Should there be term limits? So let me pose that question to you. Do you think, as a person that's joined the board at age
Right.
36, that there should be term limits for directors?
Well, I do think that there should be a process for making sure that your board composition stays current. And so I think that the right person for the board could be 30 or they could be 80 years old. Many companies use either term limits or age limits to limit the term on the board and to keep the committees and the board fresh and with new talent. And many companies use both of those mechanisms very successfully, but I think they're often used in lieu of a really robust board evaluation process. And I think that if the board is honest with itself and looks at its committees and looks at the members honestly around the table and evaluates the right mix of the board members that the company will need to go forward, I think that you will often find that there are skills and attributes that you need that you don't currently possess, and so that you would need to recruit new directors for that. And I think that you'll find there's some redundancy around the board room table. And so the people that realize that they aren't maybe in possession of the skills that are necessary for the company going forward need to, do the right thing and either not run for election at the next round or step down when the time is right. And I think it's all about doing the right thing for the company.
Well, we do know the challenge with all that, and that is boards have typically found it difficult to do, do
Right.
that themselves. But I think we're seeing signs of it getting better and better, and certainly shareholders are applying their own emphasis that companies
Right.
should be doing that. So when I had the chance to look at your committees that you serve on, you cover everything. You're on an audit committee, you're on a comp committee, and I can see why you would be on audit committees because you're a financial expert. But what's interesting is you chair the NomGov committee. So the NomGov committee, in my mind, is when you look at its charter, there's probably nobody's committee that is growing in responsibilities more than the NomGov committee. So tell me what you believe your biggest challenges are as chair of the committee.
Well, as chair of compensation or as chair of corporate governance and nominating, I think that your two biggest responsibilities are really CEO succession planning and board succession planning. And my belief is that every CEO has their season. And even the best CEO over the past 10 to 20 years may not be the right type of CEO going forward for the organization. And so CEO succession really needs to be forward-looking and dynamic. And you have to have a strong collaboration between the CEO and strong communication between the CEO and the board to really focus on what the strategic direction of the company is and to make sure that you're evaluating the skills and attributes that you will need in a CEO going forward. And so that's a really important part of the process. I think then the other really important responsibility is board succession planning. And just like a CEO, I think board members, as we just discussed, have their own seasons. And so you need to constantly, through the board evaluation process, think about what types of board members you will need to keep the composition fresh and growing into the future.
Well, we'll have to keep an eye and see how easily that goes for you. Now, you and I have had the opportunity to meet before. You have been somebody that has a good appetite for board education, so we've met at previous events. But I would be curious, what do you say as chair of the NomGov committee to your boards relative to their need to be educated?
Well, I think board education is more important now, more than ever. And in addition to, of course, staying on top of general business and political issues, you as a board member, you need to stay on top of, risk oversight for the entire organization, risk compliance, regulatory risk, compensation issues, audit and accounting issues, corporate governance trends, and even crisis communication plans. These are all issues that will ultimately affect the board, and I think you need to stay on top of them. It's part of your duty as a board member. And so I actually do find the corporate board member peer exchanges to be the most effective venue for me, because I think it's great to have a small group of directors that can sit around the table and talk about the particular areas of concern for them at the time. And so it's a really great venue, and you also form great relationships as a result of spending the day together. So.
Would you please tell the audience that I didn't pay you to say
You
that?
did not pay me.
You are one that certainly has made the most of their experience. And we have about a minute and a half left here.
Okay.
But what message would you send out there to young people who have been successful, that are eager to have the opportunity to serve on a board someday?
Well, I think the most important thing to do is to perform well when you're in a high-stakes setting. I think that the people that see you excel are the ones that are most likely to nominate you for a board. And so that's important. I think the other thing that's helpful is if you happen to be able to be in a situation where you can be in the boardroom and learn about what it takes to be an effective board member. That gives you an incredible leg up. And then finally, I think it's most important to understand the commitment that you're wanting to make. It's really important to understand the commitment as well as your motivations for wanting to do this. And so I think if you're trying to join a board for money or prestige, I think you'll be disappointed in a relatively short order. There's an incredible amount of information that you need to digest in a short period of time. You can have you're making group decisions that are often scrutinized from the outside without all of the information that you're privy to, so you have to be able to stand up to that. You also run the risk of having your time commitment be exponentially increased if the company's going through transition or crisis, and you also have your reputation at risk. So I think you really need to be sure that the reason you're joining the board is because of your unwavering commitment to your fiduciary duty to shareholders, and then you believe that you will really provide help to the company in terms of their competitiveness and their strategic direction. And those, I think, are the best reasons to join.
Well, Sara Lewis, you only confirmed why companies would want you as a board member. And I want to thank you for joining us on the show. And that will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week to take a look at another key topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. And we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partners, the Center for Audit Quality and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.